Hello, everyone. I guess we can get started since it's about noon today. Hi, I'm Rachel Clipp. I'm a medical computing expert at Kitware. I lead several of our medical modeling and simulation efforts, and I'm the lead for the Pulse Physiology Engine. I'm here today with Aaron Bray, the lead software developer on Pulse. We've worked together on the modeling and development of computational physiology engines for almost 15 years now, despite the fact that he did not believe me when I said that today. Thanks for joining us today to discuss the Pulse platform. Just a couple of information pieces. After the webinar, we'll be sending a follow-up email with a recording of the session and a PDF of the slides, so you'll have everything you need to revisit the content, share it with your team, or reach out to us to discuss more about what you're interested in. Throughout the webinar, feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature, and we'll try and get to those questions throughout the presentation as well as after the live demo portion of the webinar. So as we wait for everyone to settle in, I'd like to give a brief introduction to Kitware. Kitware is a leading provider of software and AI R&D services, working with customers in the government, industry, and academia in computer vision, medical computing, scientific computing, and high-performance software solutions. Our mission is to develop innovative software tools that empower researchers, clinicians, and industry professionals. In addition to the Pulse platform, which we'll talk about today, Kitware leads the development of a wide range of platforms that serve diverse fields, including in medical imaging, scientific visualization, artificial intelligence, and high-performance computing. Some of our key platforms are CMake, a widely used build system that simplifies software compilation and management, VTK and ParaView, industry-leading visualization tools for 3D data analysis and scientific computing. And we're going to talk more about the Pulse Physiology Engine today. We're a highly collaborative company. We participate in large research efforts funded by the federal government as well as smaller research projects. We collaborate with academic and commercial partners for these efforts, and we perform custom application development. We also provide support and training on our open source platforms. Our areas of expertise span healthcare and life sciences, including computational physiology, which you're hearing about today, surgical planning and simulation, medical image analysis, bioinformatics, and more. We also work in the energy and manufacturing sectors with a focus on simulation workflows, high-performance computing, scientific visualization, and data analysis. While Pulse is used for a variety of defense customers for medical training and simulation, we also work in image and video forensics, threat detection, and activity recognition for our defense and intelligence customers. Deep learning is also a large part of what we do, including ethical and explainable AI. So now that we've talked a little bit about Kitware, I'll give a quick look at what we're going to cover in today's session. We'll start by introducing the Pulse Physiology Engine and giving you some background on what it is and what it can do. Next, we'll walk through some common use cases for Pulse in research and product development. Then we'll look at the Pulse suite of tools and the licensing structure. And to wrap up, Aaron will give a live demo of the Pulse Explorer, which will demonstrate some of Pulse's capabilities. For those of you who are just joining us, we will send out a follow-up email, including a recording of the session and a PDF copy of the slides, so you'll have everything you need to catch up on what you've missed. And throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature. So as we get started, we'd like to learn a little bit more about the background of our attendees. So with our first poll question, how would you best describe your professional or academic background? So as we've noted, Kitware works a lot with academic partners, commercial partners. We also collaborate a lot with students, and it looks like that's reflected in our poll. We have a pretty good distribution between academia and commercial professionals on this webinar, so that's great. So moving into an introduction of Pulse, let's get started and talk about exactly what Pulse is. So Pulse is a computational physiology engine. And when we talk about where it falls on the biology continuum or spectrum, we really focus on the tissue side of things moving into the organism side of things. And so the reason we do that is so that we can still have a faster than real-time computation for full body simulation. And that allows it to be paired with both training as well as research and predictive modeling. The way we've set up Pulse, we are able to extend up and down that continuum so that we have multi-scale modeling, and we use a physics-based approach so that we can couple with different higher fidelity models and different scales to represent that multi-scale, multi-fidelity approach. A little bit about the background and motivation behind this. Several years ago now, almost 15, DoD came up with the need for an open source, high quality physiology engine. And the reason was because they were creating these medical training programs to address the three main causes of death on the battlefield: airway obstruction, hemorrhage, and pneumothorax. However, whenever they created these training programs, they were reinventing the physiology each time, either through computational modeling or just through pre-programmed subject matter expert opinion. And what that did is it created differences between simulation platforms on what those vital signs would be, which created inconsistencies of training and disagreements on which was a validated model. So this led to Tatrick putting out an solicitation requesting an open source physiology engine that would address these needs for medical education, research, and training. We were part of the original team at Applied Research Associates that applied for this and was funded to work on the BioGears physiology engine. So it was a 5-year, $7 million effort that really wanted to promote this idea. In 2017, we really wanted to continue working in that open source environment, and we needed some information about how to go about that, and we reached out to Kitware. And so part of that core BioGears team, Aaron and myself, plus our colleague Jeff Webb, moved over to Kitware and forked the BioGears engine into the Pulse Physiology Engine, and we continued to develop it for the last several years here at Kitware. The BioGears engine is still being developed at Applied Research Associates as well. So now that we know kind of why we started working on this, let's talk about what the platform looks like. The platform has several layers to it. The internal core is a computational engine that's comprised of the actual mathematical models that calculate the whole body physiology in the digital twin. We've wrapped that in a common data model, which defines what a system is, what a substance is, what a patient is, what a circuit is, what a substance is. And this allows us to reuse those definitions to create many things. So instead of creating morphine and fentanyl and having to create that each time, we're able to use that substance definition to leverage our information from before to create new substances, and so on. All of that is then wrapped in a software interface, which is you're able to interact with the models to initialize the patient, advance time, apply diseases, injuries, and treatments to that patient, and then extract the information you'd like to know about that patient. And one of the biggest efforts that kind of sets Pulse and BioGears apart is when we were funded, we really put a lot of effort into the documentation. And so there's an SDK available, there are methodology reports, all of our verification and validation data, and a lot of our use cases are all available on the website. So you can go to pulse.kitware.com and access all of that information. The computational physiology models themselves have several different types of models, and they represent everything from the fluid mechanics to equipment models to feedback mechanisms. So we're able to represent both hemodynamics and gas dynamics, how substances move throughout the body through perfusion, permeability, feedback mechanisms in response to these injuries and disease states, a PK/PD model that represents everything from the actual drug entering the body through how it's absorbed, cleared, and transported throughout. We can represent the energy system, so how substances are consumed and produced and how exercise affects the body, as well as how the environment affects a casualty or a patient. So if the temperature changes, if they have more or less clothing on, what the altitude is, if they're submerged in water, all of those things affect the physiology of our patient. Then we also have a number of equipment models, such as a mechanical ventilator, an inhaler, bag valve mask, and we're working to develop an ECMO model now. As I noted, there are a lot of different types of computational models in our system, but the core are these closed-loop circuit models. And these are lump parameter models with resistors that represent resistance to flow and capacitors that represent the compliance of the system. The systems can be linked in different ways, including both direct and indirect coupling. An example of a direct coupling is we have a respiratory circuit that represents the lungs of our patient, and we're able to couple that with our mechanical ventilator at our mask node. So for example, when the patient's intubated, that mask node is then linked to the equipment model of the mechanical ventilator to become a single circuit that represents the patient on a ventilator. An indirect coupling, a good example of that is our pulmonary capillaries and our alveoli that link the cardiovascular and pulmonary systems. This is where gas diffusion occurs, or gas exchange occurs, and so gas and carbon dioxide are able to move based on the pressures and flows in those two different systems. They're able to then diffuse across that boundary in an indirect link. And now each system's changes are reflected in that gas diffusion. The way we set up our system is we model a healthy patient and we tune these parameters to represent the gender, the weight, the age of the patient. And that allows us to model different patients or create a digital twin, at least in a lot of respects, for these individual patients. Once that patient or the computational model for that patient has stabilized, we then can modify those parameters to represent a chronic disease and restabilize, or we're able to then apply actions and injuries to the patient through modifications of those parameters. Model validation is incredibly important, as I'm sure anybody who works in computational modeling knows that if you're not validated and that validation isn't published and well understood, it's very difficult to gain acceptance and uptake of the model. So what we do is validate on a variety of different levels. We validate both the resting physiology of that patient, so our healthy state, and then we also validate when we've applied an injury or an illness to patients and how that looks. We validate at a compartment level, a system level, and at the patient level. And a compartment level is really just looking at a specific organ or a specific region of the body. So the aorta, the bone, the brain, some system in that respect. And then we're able to validate things like pressure, flow, volume, maybe substance quantities, and then we compare that to data found in the literature. We then calculate the error, and then we even color code that error. We use kind of a good, fair, bad standard, I guess is a good way to put it. We color code green, yellow, and red based on that percent error. So less than 10% error is green, 10 to 30% is yellow, and 30% is red. All of this information is published for all of our models on our website. And we also include all of the references that we've used, so you can look and see where we've come up with the data. In addition to this type of validation, we also do scenario level validation. The scenario level validation allows us to create more elaborate scenarios. So we're able to apply a hemorrhage and give a drug, maybe give IV fluid administration. All of those things are kind of stacked, and then we validate it. This does create a more complex validation environment, and so in some cases we're able to use experimental data gathered from hemorrhaged pigs, for example, and we're able to validate our complex scenarios against that. In other cases, we're unable to find validation data for a patient that has a complex pneumothorax with a hemorrhage. It's difficult to get published data for that. For these cases, what we do is work with our group of subject matter experts and clinicians to build out a matrix of that scenario, and then they give us their qualitative assessment, and we try and validate to that. We're able to build out more complex scenarios and do automated validation reporting. There's an example of that on the right of the screen. So this is an example of a mild ARDS patient on a mechanical ventilator. We're able to give a short blurb about it. We're able to add an image of that, of the lungs, for example. We list all of the parameters we're validating and what the results are. And then in some cases, we even show a vital sign monitor or the mechanical ventilator screen to really give clinical context to that information for the user. All of that validation and verification is really important, and we use the automated verification and validation to actually ensure code quality over time. So every night we run our full suite of scenarios and get an email report to all of our email boxes letting us know that the tests have executed correctly, they were validated against our gold standard data, and which ones failed, if any, so that we can look and see what code changes caused issues and rapidly correct those.
A couple questions we had. The repository is linked on our website, pulse.kitware.com. Just go to that webpage, and on that page you can go to all of our repositories from that homepage.
I believe you can access it from the Downloads tab.
Another question that we had was how well can we extract information from a CT scan to adjust our Pulse engine circuit?
Yes, so that's a good question. So we do not directly intake medical imaging data. However, you can look at it and conclude from the CT image if the patient has ARDS or pneumonia or some other condition. Sorry, I apologize, I'm not a clinician. But you can look and kind of determine if they have that condition, what the severity of the condition is, and you can then put that information into Pulse manually and run a simulation for the physiologic outcomes for that patient. And we can actually demonstrate how you would apply those actions to a patient during the live demo. All right, so moving into the use case scenarios, let's do our second poll question. What are your primary use cases for Pulse? And let's launch that poll. So some of the common use cases are virtual environment, high fidelity predictive modeling, synthetic data generation, and cyber physical systems. These are all cases we are going to highlight for Pulse. And it looks like we have a pretty good distribution except for cyber physical systems. Nobody likes that today. So that's great. Thanks for sharing. All right, so as mentioned, our use case examples are our virtual environments example, our high fidelity predictive modeling examples, our synthetic data generation, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about cyber physical systems. Maybe somebody will get interested in using it that way. All right, looking first at virtual environments. Here are some examples of how Pulse has been incorporated into virtual environments. You can find more information about these use cases on the Pulse in Action page. We've collaborated with a wide range of commercial companies to integrate Pulse into their products. So one example is we actually had an NIH project that Kitware led, creating a surgical simulator for rare and adverse events, and we were able to use Pulse to represent how that patient was doing during that surgical procedure. We've also worked with several companies, including Biomojo, Exonicus, and Immersed, about trauma-related injuries, and so Pulse will represent the physiologic condition of that patient during the trauma simulation, and that information can then be fed back to the user through a vital sign monitor, through the pallor of the screen, skin, and other information. And then we've also worked with some commercial companies creating products sold about airway management as well as nurse practitioner skills. Again, if you have any questions about that, we'd be happy to answer them. And we're also, there's a lot more information on these use cases on the Pulse in Action tab on our website. So moving into some of the examples of higher fidelity predictive modeling that we've done. Our first one is a multi-scale digital twin. We worked with a company in Italy called Computational Life. They had a 1D finite element model of the cardiovascular system, and they wanted to use Pulse to represent the rest of the body and then provide boundary conditions where the 1D finite element model linked. And so we were able to we had to modify our cardiovascular circuit to create a custom circuit that linked up with their 1D model. And then we were able to represent the whole body physiology with their higher fidelity simulation to look at how the body responded to different ventricular assist devices and drug treatments for cardiovascular disease. A second example is our multi-physics undex model. This is underwater blast injury. We worked on this with the DHA as well as another small business, and we developed the multi-physics simulation software. We had to expand the Pulse model from a 2-compartment respiratory model into an 18-compartment cardiopulmonary model, which basically increased the fidelity. And then it allowed us to couple that with higher fidelity blast models. So actually how that air blast would affect the lungs, how much pressure they would see. Then we were able to apply physiologic injury to that model and see how the patient would respond. And so this was combined with CFD and finite element biomechanics models to create a more complex simulation. And then the last example we have in this category is a COVID example. Many of you may remember that during the pandemic early on, there was a lot of concern about how many ventilators were available. And we were contacted by a group who was doing a study to determine, could multiplex ventilation be something that was feasible? And so what we were able to do with Pulse is create a data set of sick patients with symptoms similar to what we were seeing in COVID, and then put those on a ventilator in combined fashions to determine what kind of decision matrix we could create if we did have to put multiple patients on the same ventilator. And so the result here was a decision matrix of how to couple those patients. Moving on into our synthetic data generation use case. We have a couple of examples here. As people working in machine learning and artificial intelligence are aware, as you move into the medical space, one of the significant problems is data availability. It can be hard to access large quantities of patient data. The patient data can be skewed in different directions and not represent the wider patient population. There can be a lot of sparse or missing data. And so one thing that Pulse can do is we can create large data sets to kind of fill in the gaps in that data. And so one of the early things we tried to do several years ago was we actually created a database of hemorrhage patients to see if we could train a machine learning algorithm to predict cardiovascular collapse. And so we created a set of patients, kind of both genders across an age span. We varied some weight and other parameters. Then we applied a hemorrhage injury in different locations and different severities to that patient. And we ran the simulations out for 1 to 2 hours, I think, to see how they fared. We then fed all of that information into a temporal fusion transformer to see if we could do 2 different things. 1, predict the actual cardiovascular collapse, and 2, actually predict the vital signs out into the future. And what we found was we could do an okay job of predicting cardiovascular collapse. I think we had kind of a high false positive rate, and you can see there, when a patient decompensates due to cardiovascular collapse, you get some kind of weird discontinuities in the data that really caused some problems for the algorithms we were using. But we were able to predict out the actual vital signs pretty well. So that was a pretty interesting and exciting first look at what we could do for synthetic data. And that led us into working more on a couple of different DARPA projects. One of them we'll highlight here is called the In the Moment program. The goal of this program is to use LLMs to help medical decision makers make decisions during triage with specific medical stakeholder attributes. And so a couple of the goals with this, we wanted to really take a look at using Pulse, where we wanted to test different triage tagging algorithms to see how they fared with different population sets and different injury sets. And then we also wanted to test an LLM's performance tagging those patients. So what we needed to do for this is actually create a really accurate population. So unlike what we did with the first case, we actually dug into what Army population statistics look like. What's the gender split? What's their age range? What's their health status, height, weight, BMI, all of that information. And then we created a patient data set that was representative of that population. We then looked up injury statistics for the Army, and we applied those injuries to our patient data set. And the result is a database of 3,000 casualties that can be computed using Pulse. We're then taking those Pulse patients and we're running them through 3 different tagging algorithms, the SALT, START, and BCD triage sieve algorithms. And then we're going to compare those patients at 15-minute intervals to see kind of how they're tagged, how the patients do over time based on those tags, and see which tagging algorithms work well in what circumstances. And so this work is actually going to be presented at MHSRS in August. And so if anybody's there, we'd be happy to see you at our poster. Some additional work we're doing in the DARPA in the Moment program is we then take those Pulse patients and we actually create a text translation, an unstructured text description of that patient and their injuries. And we kind of have to give them a little bit of a story. How did that injury take place? Describe their vital signs in terms that the LLM can interpret. And then we feed those patients and their text descriptions into the LLM and ask them to make a tagging decision and explain why they did that. And we're in the process of doing this now and then comparing that back to kind of our automated, just gold standard tagging algorithm to see how the LLM performs in this area. And we're also presenting this work at MHSRS in August if you'd like to learn more about it. So leaning into our last use case of cyber physical systems, we have a couple examples here where we've paired Pulse with different hardware components. So we're working with one group to do a ventilation management trainer where we've paired Pulse with a manikin as well as a mechanical ventilator so that we can actually produce simulations and help control the mannequin behavior as well as the mechanical ventilator to see how the patient will fare over time during these training algorithms. We also worked with Bucknell and Geisinger on a closed loop fluid management system. And so they had created some algorithms they wanted to test on hardware in the loop. And so we used Pulse to do that testing for automated IV administration. And those are just a couple examples of how we worked. Again, for all of these examples we've discussed, you can go to the Pulse in Action page on our website and find out more information about not only these examples, but other examples that may be available. And if you're a current user of Pulse and you'd like to share how you're using Pulse, we'd be happy to put your information on our Pulse in Action page as well.
We had a question about how can Pulse be applied to neurology, neurosurgery cases, and how they can be simulated with the brain model.
Yeah, so our brain model is not well developed at this time, but we have had some more interest in developing it for CSF leaks, for example, and hydrocephalus. And so that's something we'd be very interested in talking more about and how we can expand our model to address that specific situation. All right, so let's move into our Pulse suite of tools. And this brings us to one of our last poll questions. Have you ever used Pulse before? So we'd like to know how many of you are new users and how many of you have experimented with Pulse before. Wow, that's actually surprising. We have a lot of people who haven't used Pulse before, so that's great. Thanks for coming to hear more about Pulse and how you could experiment with it. So as new users, we have a lot of options that you can use to leverage Pulse. The original Pulse library is all in C++. However, we have wrapped that C++ library in a Python wrapper, C#, as well as Java, trying to lower the barrier and make it as easy to use with as many different interfaces as possible. As far as integration options, I know we had a lot of virtual environment users. We have a Unity asset as well as an Unreal plugin. Our Unreal plugin was just updated and released again recently. And those are available through the Unity asset store and the Unreal plugin marketplace. So feel free to use those. We've also done a lot of testing on embedded systems for deployment. You can use Pulse with Mac, Linux, and Windows. We've released some Jupyter notebooks through Binder, and those are available in our repository if you're interested in testing those. And then we have our Pulse Explorer, which is a free user interface that we've developed that allows you to get started researching and exploring in Pulse. And that's actually how we'll do our live demo today. So we'll show you more about the Pulse Explorer in a few minutes. All right, so one of our last topics before we go into the live demo is licensing. This is a common question we get. The Pulse engine and the Explorer codebases are both under an Apache 2.0 license. This is a very permissible license. It grants you permission to use, modify, and distribute the software for any purpose, including commercial applications, without any requirement to give back to the repository. The Pulse Unity asset is free, and it's available just with the standard Unity Asset Store user agreement. And the Pulse Unreal plugin is also free and available with an Epic content license agreement. And now we'll move into our live demo. So Aaron's going to share the Pulse Explorer, and I'll kind of walk you through a couple of scenario examples that you can build and test out with the Pulse Explorer. Give us just a second to share the Pulse Explorer. All right, so now everyone should be able to see the Pulse Explorer. Again, this is a free user interface. It's available from the Downloads tab of the pulse.kitware.com website, so feel free to download it. It should be available for Mac, Windows, and Linux.
Linux usually has to be built.
Okay, Linux you'll have to build it, but there are downloadable versions for Mac and Windows. So to get started, you can load a patient. You can load a saved patient state, which means this is a saved patient that reflects either the healthy state of the patient or any injuries, traumas, or treatment that's been applied. Or you can build your own patient with the tabs that were just there on the left. So we've loaded our standard female patient. This is a healthy patient, and now you should be able to see the vital signs appear on the monitor as we've started the engine. There are many actions available in the Pulse engine, as you can see from the Actions tab, and this allows you to select different injuries and treatments to apply to the patient. You can also dig further into the physiology through data requests, and this includes the ability to scroll through different systems and add different physiologic components that may be relevant to the scenario. Since we're going to do a hemorrhage case here, Aaron has added the blood volume and the total hemorrhage rate so that we can take a look at those in addition to the vital sign monitor. So we're turning back to the Actions tab. You can add a hemorrhage, and I'll apologize now, the drop-down menus don't appear when we're sharing the screen on the webinar, so those won't be visible. So I'll try and talk you through some of those options. When you select the hemorrhage option, you can select either an external hemorrhage or an internal hemorrhage. You can select the compartment of that injury. So in this case, we've chosen the right leg. You can also choose things like left leg, arm, let's see, kidney, things like that. It just depends on what you're interested in seeing. You can then specify either a rate or severity. If you specify a rate, that is a direct value, 75 milliliters per minute, for example, that will be applied throughout the entire simulation unless you change it. If you choose a severity, for example, in this case, we're going to choose 0.7. That takes 70% of the blood flow to the leg and has it going towards the hemorrhage. When you choose a severity like this, it's kind of a nice feature because it actually calculates how much of that blood flow at each time step will leave through the hemorrhage based on the blood pressure. And so when we click apply here, you'll see an initial hemorrhage rate that jumps way up. And as the blood pressure is going to drop for this patient, you'll see that start to kind of decrease in response. And so that little bit of bookkeeping that would happen physiologically is being handled by the severity setting as opposed to the flow rate, which is going to pull that flow rate out no matter the blood pressure. So now that we've started that, you can look at things in real time. We can go back to the vital sign monitor, for example, and look at the real time setting. We can also then unlock real time and run much faster than real time. And when we do this, we can see that the heart rate will begin to climb, the blood pressure will begin to drop. We may get some minor changes in SpO2. So now we can turn the real time lock back on. And we can take a look at our data requests, and we can see how the blood volume has dropped, how the total hemorrhage rate is changing slightly over time as the blood pressure changes. Now we can also go back to our Actions tab and we can treat the hemorrhage. So some options that we have for treating a hemorrhage include stimulating a tourniquet by reducing the hemorrhage, administering IV fluids, and administering a morphine bolus. So to reduce the hemorrhage, we're going to set this severity to 0.2. Then we're going to go to the compound infusion action, and we can select saline from the drop-down menu. There are also some other options like blood and packed red blood cells. And then we can specify that we want 100 milliliters per minute fluid infusion. And then finally, we can go to our substance bolus. We can select morphine from the available substances, and we can set a dose of 15 milligrams. And so if we return to the vital sign, well, as we look at the data requests, we can now see the blood volume is increasing slightly from the fluid administration. We can look at the vital sign monitor, and we can see that we've had some vital sign changes in response to the fluid administration and the morphine administration. So this is kind of a nice quick example to show how you can represent a trauma case and how you can explore what that looks like in the Pulse Explorer. You can also go to the Scenario tab and take a look. This gives you a record of everything that you've done to the patient over this scenario, and you can save that scenario out so that you can run that again. So let's take a look at one more example. So we're going to clear this scenario, and we're going to load a new state that is reflective of a mechanically ventilated patient. So this patient has mild ARDS, and they're beginning intubated and on mechanical ventilation. So you can take a look and see the vital signs have appeared on the monitor, and now we're looking at the mechanical ventilator is turned on and active for this patient. And so what we're going to look at now is we're also going to add a couple of different data requests to this patient, including the Horowitz index, which looks at the PF ratio, as well as the transmuscle pressure. And this is kind of a nice, interesting one that shows us how the patient's spontaneous breathing is reflected while on the mechanical ventilator. So now we're going to exacerbate this patient's condition by using the ARDS exacerbation action. So we're going to increase it to a severity of 0.5 in both lungs and apply that to the patient. I do want to give one cautionary tale. Aaron and I are not clinicians, so if we're doing something a little too crazy, that's why. However, this is a good example of a worsening patient on ARDS. Taking off the real-time lock and looking at the vital sign monitor, we can see this patient's oxygen saturation start to drop. Their heart rate will start to increase in response to that. And so now we need to treat this patient by changing the parameters on the mechanical ventilator. So you can go over to the mechanical ventilator and increase the PEEP and apply that setting. And when we do that, we can switch over to data requests, and we can see that while the Horowitz index had dropped when we increased the severity of the patient's condition, it's now improving with the increased PEEP. And you can see the transmuscle pressure is reflecting the spontaneous breathing that's still occurring. If we want to turn off spontaneous breathing, there are a couple ways we can do it. We could give them a drug to sedate the patient. But what we're going to do here is use the dyspnea function, and we can increase the severity to 1, which will stop respiration from occurring. And you can see on the vital sign monitor, the little bumps in the respiratory curve will go away, and we'll see a smooth curve representative of what's happening during mechanical ventilation. And that's then reflected on all of our different screens, the mechanical ventilator, the vital sign monitor, and the data request tab. So this is just a small sampling of the capabilities of Pulse and the Explorer. If you have any questions about this, feel free to put them into the Q&A feature, and we'll try and answer those questions.
We do have a question about being on a Raspberry Pi. You absolutely can use Pulse on a Raspberry Pi. It works just fine. You can pull it and build it on the Raspberry Pi. There's instructions for that on our GitLab repository.
And if you run into any questions, feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to answer those. You can reach out to us either by reaching out directly to Aaron and I through our Kitware contact form or through the discourse forum. So switching back to our presentation, we're kind of coming to the end and wrapping up. So let's talk a little bit about what's next for us and what you're interested in. So next up for the Pulse team, we're continuing to work on some of the programs that we've highlighted, such as the DARPA in the Moment program. We're also working on another DARPA program called Goldovac to advance our hemorrhage models and add the ECMO capability to Pulse. And we're continuing to apply and have promising opportunities to explore more modeling of the differences between the male and female physiology. And we're looking more into moving more towards digital twins with that aspect of things. And we're also looking to pursue pediatric funding, which has been a strong interest of ours.
There's a question about veterinarian medical space.
Yes, so we actually had funding at one point that never kind of came together and fell out from the Air Force to do more modeling of the canine physiology. And so this is also something we've been really interested in, and we'd be happy to talk more about how to model different species for the veterinary space.
I have a question about ethnicities. How does Pulse model ethnicities differences?
It does not at this point. There is some back and forth about how to model that, and it's something we're looking into actively. We actually have applied for a digital twin modeling grant from the NIH, which has shown some promise, and we're hopeful that it will be funded, and that would be an opportunity to look more into that as well. So moving into kind of our last piece of feedback, we'd like to hear from all of our users. What are you interested in seeing in Pulse next? So what types of features do you want to see added to Pulse? And this is an open-ended question for our last poll type question. So if we could open that up to feedback, that would be great. And we'll take these responses and we'll fold these into our funding and development plans in the future. I don't know if that question came through.
We did have a question about saving data as a text file. So you are able to save a CSV file of all the data you wish to pull from the engine into something that's very easily consumable by other languages. You are able to save the state of the engine at any time and reload it if you want to. So you can concatenate states and concatenate CSV files to make a longer term simulation. So you are able to do that.
So feel free to give us feedback about what types of features you'd like to see added to Pulse in the Q&A section. That may be the best way to communicate the information, or feel free to reach out to us directly if you have more specific interests that you'd like us to take a look at. This does bring us to the Q&A portion of the webinar. I know we've covered a lot today, and we'd love to hear what other questions you have. So if you haven't added any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to address those. Just a few reminders. We will follow up at the end of the webinar with the slides and the recordings so that you can share those out or review those. And we'd love to hear more from you about what your interest with Pulse is and how we could collaborate more.
Question about orthopedics and how to integrate with modeling orthopedics.
Sure. So orthopedics, we haven't done a lot with the musculoskeletal issue. We've focused more on the computational physiology aspects of things. So I'm not, we have looked at modeling some things like breaks and the actual surgical simulation by coupling it with surgical simulators, but outside of that, we haven't done a lot in that space. But I would love to hear more about the specific questions you have and how we could perhaps work together to look into that more.
I guess a little more specifics on how we integrated into our finite element or discrete element mechanics. We did integrate with FEBio in the lung model, distributed lung model. And we did that through the Precise framework, software framework. You can kind of Google the Precise framework, and then we just basically traded data through that framework to FEBio from Pulse.
We have, I guess, a little more on that. We have created what we call a black box framework where we're able to pass information from higher fidelity models back into our model. And that was what allowed us to communicate with computational life's 1D framework. This allows us to pass things like pressures and flows back and forth between the circuit diagrams and the finite element models to actually provide feedback from those. And we can go into more details and feedback on that individually if you're interested. So one of the questions or comments was talking about an interest in incorporating or accommodating alternate models and high fidelity models, and it seems like those endeavors required collaboration with Kitware specialists. So the examples highlighted do focus on Kitware specialists because those are the projects we were involved in, so we have the most information about those and can speak to them. That doesn't mean that you cannot do it without us. All of the software is, of course, free and open source, so you're welcome to work on that without any involvement from Kitware at all. And I can't, with that, it's difficult to know who has kind of put forth those efforts without us. We do get people who have integrated Pulse into their workflows or their products, and they just want to highlight it on the Pulse in Action page, and we're happy to work with people on that level. So you may want to take a look at the Pulse in Action page and see if there's any information there.
A little bit about exercise and how to represent exercise, maybe with a little bit more detail besides the intensity level.
So right now we have exposed interacting with our physical exercise model with an intensity level, as this was kind of the most, I guess, intuitive example of how we could expose that. I guess it would be helpful to know how you want to interact with the physical exercise model. Did you want to program in specific vital sign information or specific like calorie burn rates, things like that? If so, those are things we could certainly work on exposing to allow you to input the information that way. The intensity level was just the most straightforward and kind of validation capable way we had of exposing the exercise model. Um, there was another question related to orthopedics and musculoskeletal physiology. We currently do not have any exposure of soft tissue such as the cartilage or the tendon. That's not something we're modeling. We do model tissue interactions such as their oxygenation and things like that, and metabolism that occurs in those, but that's about as far as we've taken it. We're looking at, for our hemorrhage model, some more examples of things like how lactate production and consumption and rates actually affect the health of the tissue and tissue death. So we're starting to move somewhat in that direction, but we have not done a lot with orthopedics modeling, as I said before. So kind of exploring through some of these other questions.
Synthetic image generation for CT scans or
So Pulse does not work in medical images. It's a computational physiology engine. However, the medical computing group here at Kitware can help you with synthetic image generation, including CT scans. And I'd be happy to reach out with more information on that and connect you to the right person at Kitware to talk more about that. Do you have an edited interface that could be used for STEM education for kids? I'm not entirely certain exactly what edited interface means.
I mean, the Pulse is a library available, and the Explorer is a bit clunky, but it kind of demonstrates Pulse through the API. It would be very easy to hook up a more refined, polished application on top of the engine to bring the science to a
To
little bit,
yeah, to visualize the
visualize it a little
physiology.
easier and capture a kid's attention span. So that is something that's possible, but we don't currently have that. But you could definitely build it with the free Unity or Unreal asset out there and see how that works.
Um, we had a question about how to reach us for collaboration opportunities. Yeah, there are a couple ways. So if you go to the Pulse.Kitware website, there should be a way to reach out to us from the website. There are also ways to reach out to us from the Kitware website as well. And you can also Google Rachel Clipp or Aaron Bray, and our emails will pop up on the Kitware page, and you can reach out to us directly if you want to. Um,
I guess maybe we can address sensors, wearables. How can Pulse integrate with the current market sensors?
sure, to take input from the wearable sensors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's something we've been looking into more. So we have some interest in how to what we call jumpstart a patient from their wearables. And so one thing you can do is when we showed the Pulse Explorer, you saw there was a way to set some patient characteristics. And so this is one option to take from your wearables. You can take some information you've put into your health app, like your gender, your weight. You can also pull the heart rate, sometimes even blood pressure information from that. Sometimes it gives an overall health status. We can pull all of that information in and use it to start a patient pretty easily. There's also been some interest in kind of tracking patients over time or tracking the health status of soldiers or so on from their wearables. And that's something we're looking into. How can we simulate out some time, then kind of check back in with the wearable and reset the simulation to get a little bit closer to where they actually are and so on to predict out maybe how long they can continue to stay in the field, what's their dehydration status, do we need to get more fluids in that person, etc. So I think that's definitely an active area of research that we want to continue to explore and something we've experimented with in a little bit. So another question about Raspberry Pi and its sensors.
Absolutely. Any data you can kind of take, you can push in through an action to get into the engine. So it'll run fine on Raspberry Pi. You just have to translate your sensor input into a action and give it to Pulse that way. For example, compression. You can take a pressure sensor, and as you push down, we can take that pressure exerted from the sensor and pass it into the engine as the force applied to the simulated body. So CPR is a very good example that you could use a sensor with, something that's actually taking in that real push and translating it into the synthetic environment, applying that pressure to the chest, and then pumping blood accordingly. And then there's also ventilator. You can give us pressures, volumes, flows, and from a real sensor into Pulse, and we can exchange data that way.
There was a question about using Pulse with ParaView. So we've actually done a couple of integrations with Pulse and ParaView. They're available on the Pulse in Action page. One is called VPAW. It's the Virtual Pediatric Airway Workbench. And while we don't have a pediatric model, we were feeding, for experimental reasons, airway information from Pulse into the simulation. So there are some examples of how you can do that. VPAW is one. We also did a simulation on anaphylaxis and the treatment with epinephrine, where we fed the simulation into ParaView so that we could then get a dynamic visualization of the lungs expanding and contracting and the color changes represented. We kind of did a color change representation of the oxygen saturation as well. And both those examples should be on the Pulse in Action page that you can take a look at. And if you have additional questions about those, we'd be happy to answer those. Feel free to reach out.
Can we do long-term cardiovascular health predictions, such as decades, like a longer-term analysis?
So at this point, our models both run too slow and it'd be difficult to simulate for decades. And we really haven't looked at kind of the age progression. We do have some representations of aging, but not into the geriatric time frame. So I would say our models at best have been untested for that time length. So someone reached out about who is the best person to speak with about developing veterinary applications. Reach out to me, rachel.clipp@kitware.com. Anybody can reach out to me for that matter, but I'm probably the best person to speak to you about getting started with a veterinary application. Can Pulse simulate arrhythmia? Yes, it can. We do have a variety of different arrhythmias in our cardiovascular model. So you can look at, let's see, ventricular tachycardia, for example. You can look at AFib, VFib. There are several different ones. And if you go to our cardiovascular methodology on our website, you will be able to see exactly which arrhythmias and treatment options for those arrhythmias are available. Oh, there you go. So yes, this section of our documentation shows some of the available arrhythmias and how we validated those arrhythmias. So just taking a look to see if there are any additional questions. If I missed your question or you didn't have a chance to ask it, please reach out to us and I'd be happy to get back in touch with you and answer any further questions you have. But otherwise, I think we've covered the majority of the questions. Did you answer this one about, can you share the GitHub link for the project? I only found Python projects.
Yes, please go to the pulse.kitware.com and everything is on that landing page.
Yep.
Modeling heart attacks specifically, I mean, you can...
Yeah, myocardial infarction. So we don't model a specific type of heart attack. We do have a cardiac arrest model, which stops the heart. And so that is available and you can take a look at the methodology to see how exactly that works. If you want to have a more high fidelity model of the heart itself and exactly what's happening during myocardial infarction, we'd be happy to talk more about that and how we could link it into Pulse. But in the meantime, the cardiac arrest model may do enough of what you need to take a look. All right, I think that has brought us to about our hour time frame. Thank you so much for attending. It was really great to talk to everybody today. If you have any additional questions or want to reach out to us in the future, please do. You can reach me at rachel.clipp@kitware.com. Erin is erin.bray@kitware.com. That information is available on the website, and you can also reach out to us directly through the Kitware, I think it's kitware@kitware.com email address, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or have follow-ups with specific people with their interests. But thank you very much. It was great speaking with everyone.